take like the alignment high and low, and you take knowledge high and low. The people who are high alignment, high knowledge is what I call an aligned person. And you build that person, and they're jamming with you. They're like, man, I need more information on this. Hey, I'm in this situation. I'm doing this. They're with you. Those are easy. They're great. Don't take them for granted. Keep pumping them, keep working them. The bottom side are what I call dismissives, which are people who are very low knowledge, and they keep you at bay. They don't like you. They're not easy to deal with.
Welcome to the Elev8 podcast. I am your host and coach, Tyler Johnson. Thank you for tuning in. And whether you've tuned in to elevate your mindset, your game, or just your day, you're in the right place. My guest this episode is a two-time national champion baseball player at Louisiana State University. He's now a clinical and sports psychologist and the founder of his business, The Mindside. He has more than a decade of experience working with PGA, LPGA, and Korn Ferry Tour players. Last year, his golf clients amassed over $25 million in winnings alone. He is also the sports and performance psychologist for the University of Alabama's athletic department, working with the 2015, 2017, and 2020 national championship football teams. Welcome to the Elev8 podcast, Dr. Bhrett McCabe.
Man, I'm awesome. Thanks for having me.
Good. We're excited to have you. Got a great career in the field of the things we talk about on this podcast. And, also I think a great perspective as a former student athlete and two-time national champion, right?
Yep.
What led you from, being an athlete to the work that you do now, and kind of what led you on that journey?
It's a good question. When I was playing, I struggled. I always struggled with confidence, right? I was confident, but I always did the little things right. I always did like the 85% right, but the extra 15% of that dog in the fight, I just didn't have. I think it was because I was a late bloomer, like really late, and didn't mature till late. Like a male, I didn't have that testosterone boost of like, don't run you over type of thing. We didn't like football because I was never the mean guy,
Yeah.
And so I had to learn how to push that. And it didn't come to the point until I'd kind of lost my ability per se, like the talent that I had lost due to an injury that I had to find it. And it became the only angle I had to be able to compete. And when I did that, it turned me onto the side of psychology. I was not a psych guy. In fact, I'm still not, I don't even consider myself a psychology guy. But it just opened me up to what was possible. And, I'd been in environments where I'd been around that before, but I'd never really understood it. And it just took me on a journey. And next thing I know is I'm sitting here. And so I think it was really my stuff, and go from there.
Gotcha. I know in between, you spent some time after college in the medical field, correct?
Yep.
What?
So when I finished training, I went into the pharmaceutical industry and worked in research and development and education out on the field. And I loved it because it was about strategic development and processes. And we went to pharma allowed me to kind of create being in field-based and work on the things that I did, and work on education. And there was a lot of psychological implementation of what we did. It was educating providers and researchers based on our set data and our research. And now, let's be honest, right now, the pharmaceutical industry is not the highest integrity field there is, given what's happened in the last couple of years. But there's a whole lot of really, really good stuff that does go on in the pharmaceutical industry. And I was fortunate enough to work with a division that did that. And so I was able to go out and work with Pride, but to help people educate it and stuff like that.
So,
when you're looking at coaching people and helping them succeed, or looking at how to take a product and get understanding and identify barriers, it's not much different, right? You're trying to create plans to help people work through whatever they're going through.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask was really the what things do you take from that you see, with your working with athletes, teams, and executives?
Yeah, some of it's programming, meaning the programming idea of it's very easy as coaches, and whatever we do in coaching, to always react and try to fix a problem. right? We're going to fix this. We're going to fix that. We're going to fix this. We're going to do that. And what happens is you end up walking around just trying to put out little fires, but you never get to the core of the issue. Now, a lot of people in my field, in traditional psychology, they want to go to the core of the issue immediately, and people don't open up to that.
Right.
Like, no, you got underlying whatever. It's like, dude, and I learned that lesson firsthand. I had a patient who came in when I was in training, and she came in for depression. And when I did the analysis or the assessment, it was clear she had obsessive compulsive disorder with longstanding limitations. And I was so excited. This is it, man. I'm go out there. I'm going to fix this. This is so cool. And she never came back. And my advisor met with me later, and he goes, why don't you think she ever came back? And I said, well, he said, she came in for an oil change and you wanted to sell her a brand new car. It's not what she came in for. Yeah. And so I think learning those different things of when a player's working and team's working, they're going to give you this. They're going to give you that test trial. Well, that was the same in pharma. I'd go meet with a provider, a researcher, developer, state, whatever, and they would go, you had to find out what they wanted. And then I kind of understand where was their resistance.
Sure.
And I kind of always conceptualize business people, and I still do it today, into 4 different types of people. And it's based upon knowledge base and acceptance. Okay. So alignment and knowledge. We've all coached somebody who has a really deep understanding of what they're doing. Okay. But they're in line with you, and you can jam on them. You can come back and say, hey man, listen to this great video, and you're not going to freak them out. You have other people you give the video to and they never watch it, but they'll tell you how great it is and so what I did is I realized is that if you take like the alignment high and low, and you take knowledge high and low, the people who are high alignment, high knowledge is what I call an aligned person. And you build that person, and they're jamming with you. They're like, man, I need more information on this. Hey, I'm in this situation. I'm doing this. They're with you. Those are easy. They're great. Don't take them for granted. Keep pumping them, keep working on them. The bottom side are what I call dismissives, which are people who are very low knowledge, and they keep you at bay. They don't like you. They're not easy to deal with. And so what they do is, because they don't want you to know that they don't know what they're really talking about, is they attack you, and they come out. We all know that hyper a-hole who just beats you down, resists you for everything, creates drama. You're screwing me over, all this other stuff. And what happens is we get on our heels and be like, oh, dude, I'm trying. I'm like, stuff like that. But the reality is that what happens is they're doing that because they don't want you in. They don't want you in their kitchen. Okay. Yeah. Now, those people you may not be able to change. You may have to find a way to develop a link there. And so sometimes coaches, I'll tell coaches to work with the players, like, if you are button heads, find something that you guys can communicate about that maybe has nothing to do with the sport. Like, hey, man, I don't know if you saw that most recent episode of Mayor of Kingstown. God almighty, man, that thing is freaking badass. And all of a sudden they start realizing that they're not trying to hurt me. They're not trying to, but what happens is coaches are like, that guy's not responding. Boom, I'm going harder. And all they're doing is they're getting more and more of a problem. The other 2 are the interesting ones. The person who has a lot of knowledge but's not very aligned to us is what we call an antagonist. And we see them as squeaky wheels. But the reality of the fact is they just have a different philosophy, and they know what they're doing. They're knowledgeable. And so as a coach, what you have to do is understand how to communicate with them. Is like, hey, look, I know you and I have some different ideas on this. How do you think this should go? Now, what you're doing is you're not saying I'm just giving in to them, but like, hey, I know you transferred in from another school. You guys ran a more up tempo offense. And right now we're really focusing on defense. How did you guys, how would you see the way to communicate that? And what you're doing is you're giving them a little bit of rope, but you're wheeling them in by building trust. They just may have a completely different theory. And that happens a lot in the middle game. Like people who are heavy meditative based people, I'm not going to get them to be intentional, focused, and energy, right? They're just different, and it's cool. The other one's the danger, and it's what I call an accommodator. They're very low knowledge, but very high agreement, and they make us feel like a rock stars. Man, it's awesome. That person that's my guy. That's my girl. Got it. They ain't doing anything. Like I've got players who will be like, yeah. No. I've been journaling. I'm like, well, let's look at it. Well, I didn't bring it. I'm like, you're not doing it. Which is fine. That's my job. Is I got to figure out why they don't want to do it. But don't sit there and tell me how great it is and how much you're learning from your journaling when I know you're not doing it.
Yeah.
Right. And so as a coach, we have to understand, what do we have to do for that accommodator? Why are they being so agreeable with us? They're keeping us, once again, like the dismissals, away. And they're pleasing us to make us feel good so we don't get in there. And that was one of the things I learned in pharma, is that we dealt with those people all the time. And you'd walk out of a meeting and be like, that was awesome. And it started hitting me when I started supervising people. I was like, you didn't get anything done. They just kept you 2 steps away from them the entire time. And nobody would ever bring their boss in to meet the antagonist because they weren't on board.
Sure.
And if coaches could break down the players in that way, it's like, okay, I've got aligned people, I've got antagonists, I got accommodators, say everything right, and then we got some dismissives. It's okay, but you can coach over one of them.
Yeah. And one of our guests, that last group, they're usually identified as high character, right?
Yeah.
I like them, and so, but is it the right kind of character for your team? And I think
100%.
that was how kind of that made me kind of think of that.
My coach used to say, and this sounds terrible, so I'll say this, but my coach says, coaches can't be afraid to take a risk on a kid. There are troubled kids. There are kids that make mistakes. Okay. There's certain no-goes, right? But and every coach has to have those lines. I mean, obviously violence against women and things like that. I mean, those are no-goes. But he's like, if I got a player who I have to get out of a fight, kind of fight at a bar. And when I wasn't playing the drinking age league team in Louisiana, so you could go and coach educated us. He didn't keep us away from it. This is a guy that I've had to go bail out, right? I didn't take away the consequences. We never did that.
Right.
But if he knew I didn't crap on him, I didn't send him down the river, and I didn't shut him out, and then he knew I had him, and I was there for him. And then when I needed him, he was there for me. Right. I think coaches sometimes see those tough players as not buying in, and they reject him. And they're like, well, I've tried. I've done all this. Well, have you met them where they are? Why is a player resisting you? Why is a player? I mean, sometimes players, they're running from their demons. They're running from their fears. And you are a person of authority that's telling them they have to do this and they have to accommodate this. And maybe they don't want to. Maybe they're afraid they can do it. And nobody's ever really believed in him. But I tell them I believe in them. Yeah, it's different. And so, to your point, like those accommodators, high character, great kids, but they just melt. They're marshmallows under pressure, because they don't have that fire underneath them.
Yeah. Your book, Break Free from Suckville. My wife was curious when she saw that book on my desk, like, what's that about? And then I quickly in about 5 minutes, showed her the first page. I played college football at Northern Iowa. I lived in the same house that Kurt Warner did at the end. So I sucked me in right from the first story there. And always, being a UNI guy, you've heard the Kurt Warner legend a lot, but I loved your take on it. The things you kind of talk about in there, I think one of the things that stuck out in the process with your athletes is journaling. And how can journaling help us as athletes, as coaches, as people, just to navigate our lives?
Well, we got to have it. We got to have a way of understanding and taking all the stuff that's going on in our noggin, right? We got so many things bombarding our head. We got to have a way to download it, right? I got to my computer this morning and I hear it in the background, it's running, it's downloading. What do? We just stuff it. We never learn, we just whatever. But in reality, journaling allows us to look at the trends. If you're in medicine and you're in surgery, a surgeon or whatever, they do M&Ms, mortality and morbidity conferences. If you're in the military, after you do an action, they do an after action report. In coaches, we do reviews, but what a lot of times coaches do is they just put the stats in somebody's locker or they give them the immediate feedback. I mean, if I just came in from driving from traffic and somebody goes, what were you doing at 9 o'clock this morning? It's like, what in the hell are you talking about?
Right.
But if 24 hours later we sit down and say, look, in this moment, this is some things that this was the contributor. Well, that's what journaling allows us to do. It's like allows me to download it and say, hey, look, I wasn't that much of a jerk out there today. I wasn't as off as I thought I was. In the moment, I thought it was brutal. I think journaling allows us to have a download moment.
Definitely. I think I've heard, athletes talk about see and feeling when it comes to our mechanics in
Yeah.
coaching. And I think sometimes, we did it, we feel our thoughts and see them. And I think,
Well, and you remember one of the things that, like, I can look at somebody if I'm with a movement specialist or coach, whatever, and look at somebody and go, man, they're going to have some limitations there, right? I mean, they got a hip, whatever they do. Mentally, what do we look at? We look at body language. Body language ain't real. Okay. It's a reflection of self-image, but some people will fake it to try to fake it, whatever. But nobody has a thought bubble above their head with running thoughts of fears, doubts, and insecurities. So when we see body language, we assume they got it. But when you hear a player say, God, I was so nervous there. Yeah. And you're like, what? You didn't even look it. And because I'll ask players, like, would you feel pressure or stress? No, I don't feel it. I don't feel that. I'm like, really? Because if I put you at the top of Mount Everest, would you feel pressure and stress? Well, I mean, I don't know. If you ever gone snow skiing and go, like, you get up to the top of the mountain, you may not feel it, your body is. Okay. So that's what I want them to realize. Instead of saying it as a native, it's like, what did I learn in that environment? What was the experience in that environment? And now they have a great opportunity to grow from it. And so without having a thought bubble, I don't know what you're going through. Yeah. I see you smiling and cutting up with family and all that. I'm like, man, they must be happy. Yeah. No idea that, husband and wife can't communicate, or kids are scared to tell the parent what they really believe, or we're at a coaching, the coach looks like they got it all together, and players see that and they come in there and then they're like, the two biggest anxieties of kids today. Number one, anxiety is just running rampant. Okay. Number one is, am I as good as I think I am? Most athletes have this fear of, am I actually as good as I fear that I want to be? And I'm going to say this is like us, in our generations, it was go figure it out and come back and find a way, because growth and development was the standard. But because of the faster windows of success now, people think they have to have it or they don't know. Yeah. Okay. Number two is, does my coach like me? I've got all Americans that have played at Bama, okay, where I work. And they're like, does coach like me? I'm like, and that's that big of a deal. Yeah. And I get it. And the reason for that is insecurity is so high. Insecurity over acceptance of what they do. Is, if a coach likes me, then they're going to give me grace. Yeah. Because nobody else gives them grace in their life. Yeah. Social media doesn't give you grace. Nothing.
What a military friend of mine once brought up how they referenced a lot in his Marine group, the difference between likership and leadership. And I'm curious how, like, after hearing what you say there, it's like does it matter if they like us? Maybe. I don't know. It depends on the context of the person. I'm still going to go to work. And so how does that fit as a coaching, like in the likership leadership kind of balance?
I love that analogy. Leadership is hard because, as my buddy who's CEO of $1 billion company said, and he has to answer to his venture capital firm, right, that runs them. He's like, at the end of the day, I run a benevolent dictatorship. Okay. It's not a democracy. I mean, we're actually not a democracy either in this country. No. And so everyone's like, oh, we're federalists, whatever. I get that. What I mean is, we hire people to make decisions on behalf of us.
Right.
They're not asking us, what do you think, every single day? Okay. We get paralyzed by choice. Well, we also get paralyzed by the need to have people like us. And so when you're leadership, that's why early in training, they make it very clear as a clinician is that when you do like psychological testing and you look at, there's an old test, I don't know if it's really used all that much anymore, but it was a test that they gave, and they said, if you gave, and you looked at the profiles of serial killers, CEOs, physicians, attorneys, and all, they looked identical. Because you have to have low empathy. People make decisions in leadership that impact thousands of people. Yeah. And you can't worry about Mary or John 5 levels down. You can worry about them, but when you make the decision, you got to make decisions for the masses. Okay. What gets people a mistaken leadership is that the narcissism runs, and then instead of being a benevolent dictatorship, they're a money-hungry, grabbing, thriving in power and leveraging against people. And that happens in coaches too, right? Sure. Coaches lose as they get bigger and their personality gets bigger. They lose their connection to players because it becomes about them. Great leaders always stand in the shadows, even great coaches. great coaches. People will say, well, what about Deion Sanders now? Well, let me say, I think Deion Sanders has a brilliant way of, you played the game. He has a brilliant way of taking the attention away from his players.
Yes.
But he'll highlight his players when he needs to.
Yes.
He's taken all the negative stuff away. He's
yes.
Nobody even knows who's going there right now. All they know is Prime is doing stuff. That's the goal. People are working behind the scenes. He's got the attention and the eyes, but where he's in control of them. He's like a politician. He's controlling the rhetoric. And I love it. But what happens is the likership stuff is, as coaches, you've got a bunch of people who have very fragile egos. Okay. Now that's not this generation. I'm not, as my daughter would say, oh, you always say this about our generation. That's anybody in a competitive environment has a fragile ego.
Sure.
People have to realize even the best in the world are insecure. Okay. Because if you were truly secure, you wouldn't push hard and you wouldn't grow to go to new levels.
And expectations
right? You can
rise.
have belief in self and what you're doing, but you can't. You can't go to, whatever. And so the leadership thing is I have to make decisions that are much larger. And the biggest mistakes I've ever made in my career from a leadership standpoint in my business is I haven't listened to my gut. I've listened to people I've hired and been like, I need you to do this and come back to me. And they come back and they don't get it. And it's half-assed and whatever. And I'm like, but where I struggle is because I'm not real good about do this or else. And then people get whiny and frustrated and all that. And I'm like, I just can't do it. I could probably do it easier if it wasn't my company. Like if I was, like I asked my buddy, I said, is it easier to manage somebody else's company? He's like 100%, because it's either my neck or theirs. Like when it's your name on the wall, it's your reputation, right? Yeah. He's like, I'll just go to another company if I can't get, but he said, ultimately it's my failure if I can't get the organization to follow. It's the same with a coach, right? It's easier if I can get a football team to buy in. But what happens is, this, it's rarely the coach's scheme that fails them. It's their connection to their players.
No doubt.
When a player does not feel bought into, and that coach cannot relate to them. Everyone's afraid of a player's coach, right?
Yeah.
But on your coaching staff, you had coaches that were players' coaches that buffered against the head coach.
No doubt.
And if the head coach was a little bit more of a player's coach, he had the a-hole assistant coaches that got you back in line, right?
No.
Okay, that's fine. That's cool. Everybody knows their role. And so the leadership is having a vision and getting people to buy into it, but holding people accountable. Yeah. Likability is we don't hold people accountable because we just want to be liked.
Yeah. I worked in the White Sox front office, and I'm glad you brought up Deion because I live here in Colorado.
And, okay. Yeah.
So it's a lot of PR. But he does remind me of when I was with the White Sox, Ozzie Guillen was the manager. And I remember one time in an internal meeting, someone asked him about his charisma and this, and he's like, yeah, they weren't asking Jim Thome why he was 0 for 5, were they? But people didn't understand the method to his madness of kind of, I think, I'll get the eyeballs where I want them, and my players need time. And I think
there was a situation that happened at Bama about, 8-9 years ago. There was a quarterback battle going on. This is before Jalen and Tua, maybe the beginning of Jalen. There was a couple off-season issues that were really, really small, but blown up in the media because they were on the top of the board. You know how that is. And coach goes to media days and gets into a fight with Paul Feinbaum on live air. And everyone's like, I can't believe he's on. I'm like, brilliant. Because nobody talked about the other issues.
The rest of the media day.
Nothing. He knew. I'm like, that guy, God, I love that guy for that reason. He knows what he's doing.
From average leaders to great leaders, they can control their people and the messaging,
Yes.
And sometimes I think as an athlete, I think there's in college athletes that, there's some appreciation when there's similarity from the coach to the message to the team and the media, but awareness that they're not always going to be as such. And I think there's that.
You working in the major leagues, right? Let's say the White Sox are going through a rebuild. I haven't really paid much attention, but let's say they're going through a rebuild. And they hire a manager. Like I always looked at like Buck Showalter. Buck Showalter built the Yankees. He built the Diamondbacks. He built the Rangers. He built the Orioles. Now he's building the Mets. But somebody always came in behind him to win the World Series, if you notice, or be there. Okay. If the leadership of the White Sox came out and said, and the Braves did this a couple of years ago, actually, we're 3 years away from competing for a pennant. So you're going to see some young players play. You're going to see some guys coming in, but we're building something, and we need you guys to buy into this team now as fans. And we know that takes a lot because sometimes we're going to get kicked in but we're not going to chase the Dodgers way. We're not going to do that. Like, we're not going to chase because you know what? It really doesn't help them. They win pennants, but they don't win anything else besides one World Series. We're going to build, and we need you guys behind us. So the manager is going to make some decisions, or I'll put some players out there you may not think are right. Like, I would love it if an organization, but everyone's like, no, I wouldn't say that. We're going to act like it doesn't happen. It's like, who are we fooling? Like, you're running a kid out there who's so he doesn't have the ability yet, but he might in 2 years. So don't jeer this guy. Like, we're going to get him some reps. We're going to try to win games. We're trying to win, but we're trying to win with a little bit talent deficit and experience.
Yeah, no doubt. With if it gave you a magic wand and you could change something about student athletes or their experience and make it better, what would you wish for?
I wish we'd give them the right to develop. I think we are in things like NIL. I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. Market will determine its viability. Okay. Boosters are not going to pay $5 million to an unproven high school quarterback who's never taken a snap in college, right? Eventually, people are going to go out, done that, didn't get anything in return. It's supply and demand. It's capitalism. I wish that we would. I wish we'd get rid of the 20-hour work week in college sports and go back to not having that rule there. I think it's done more damage than good. I played my freshman year without it, and it was wonderful. Then all of a sudden, coaches had all kinds of rules that they had to follow, and they tried to extend it. And they're going to push against it, right? You draw the line, they're going to push against the line. You don't give them rules. They're going to manage load very well, particularly in science. I think you can get rid of that now. I think giving them the right to improve, and I wish every player had a written down formal player development plan that they came into. Mm-hmm. I think we pretend that college sports is an amateur event. I mean, major college baseball and some of the other sports finally got rid of the volunteer assistant. That's hogwash. I think we have to look at it and say the teams that have very strong professional ranks, golf, baseball, basketball, football, women's basketball now is growing, women's soccer is growing. We need to see these as feeder schools, feeder programs to major league sports. I would rather them have applicable degrees versus degrees of passing. So, I was in school with Shaquille O'Neal. Like, come on. Now, he ended up getting his degree, but I mean, let's look at this and say, here's a business degree that gives you how to manage finances, how to do communications, how to do that. Like, I can see that. Like, let's give them a degree in general studies. I don't know what that really gives a person.
They don't even cover general life. like kids are always looking like, teach me life skills, teach me how to run my checkbook,
100%. Teach me how to, and people go, oh, come on, that should be taught. It's not being taught.
Where?
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what we do is we take our student athletes and say, hey, you got to go to an 8:00 meeting with life skills. And they're like, oh my God, I've been at since 5. All right. How do I survive this? And I'm not knocking this. I mean, those people work hard. They got brutal jobs because they're trying to find engagement when players are just like
exhausted.
So let's use what if you're an art history major, awesome. That jams you. Bring it. Okay. But I think we got to look from these college athletes, or we got to look at our colleges and say, what are we teaching? Like, we're not even teaching trades. Like, I mean, if that's the case, teach somebody to weld or get an electrician's degree. It's like, well, that's not a degree you have in college. Why not? So give them a skill. Like, I think every kid in business should have video editing skills, audio production skills, and how to market like that. Marketing of doing brochures and messaging is not marketing anymore. Marketing is getting a message out and driving content. So I would do that. Like, I don't, I get a communications degree is great. Okay. But let's get them applicable skill sets that we can look at and say, let's be honest. I mean, a kid comes as a football player, basketball, soccer, baseball, golf. He's like, I want to go to med school. Awesome pathway. Here we have. I want to be a lawyer. Here's how we do it. I want to be a school teacher. I want to be a coach. Perfect. Here are the game plans. But I want to be a pro athlete. We're like, nah, we can't say that.
It's taboo. Yeah.
It's taboo. Like, come on. Like, you should be able to look at it and say, hey, look, that's great. Okay. Because I'm not going to pee in your cereal. How are we going to do this? How are we going to develop that? And what are the fallback skills you have?
Yeah.
Like my roommate in college was the 8th pick in the major league draft. He got a degree in finance because he knew he was going to be dealing with money. That was brilliant.
Good idea. Yeah. Well thought. As we wrap up, one last question I'd like to kind of touch on. If I could give you a time machine to go jump into and visit 16-year-old Bhrett, back then, from experiences and things you've learned in your journey and expertise, what advice would you want to give yourself?
Well, first of all, I'd say, doing your junior year on junior varsity baseball is going to be the best thing you ever do. So don't be upset and embarrassed by it. Learn how to compete in the biggest moments, and it's messy. You don't need approval or safety to be great. You need to have the wherewithal to push through all this. That life is going to give you many opportunities. Get as many invitations as you can, do as many dances as you can in that, and learn from as many people as you can, because the learning of life comes from the relationships we build and the experiences we have, not what people tell you that it should be.